Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. This is the post-game podcast for the Timberwolves' disappointing loss to the Memphis Grizzlies on MLK Day. We're going to break down what happened in this one. Ant's big start to the game. We got some Luka Garza rotation minutes. We got a lot of Rob Dillingham. He was great. And then a flat finish. Some questions about how the Wolves finished this one. We'll break it all down here today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Prizepicks. Now's the perfect time to join. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's right. No need to win to get the bonus. It's guaranteed. Prizepicks, run your game. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hopefully you've had a fantastic start to the week and MLK Day yesterday. The Timberwolves, of course, had the matinee TNT game, 1:30 p.m. tip, and it was a really fun game. Minnesota led by double digits for a good chunk of the game and just kind of was a little bit flat offensively at the end. I want to dig into that a bit. Some unique rotation things with some early Rudy Gobert foul trouble, and of course the absence of Dante DiVincenzo. And kind of a tale of two halves for Anthony Edwards and Naz Reid, too. Some big moments in this one as both Reid and Rob Dillingham continued some recent strong play. We talked about that on yesterday's show, but that continued through this Memphis game, too. Both those guys played well. So we'll cover all that today on the show on this post-game podcast. A big thank you, though, off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can also watch on Locked On Sports Minnesota, the app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And, of course, anywhere you listen to audio podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. A reminder about the Locked On Wolves daily newsletter. You can sign up on LockedOnDaily.com. We do it every day, Monday through Friday. You'll get some basically thoughts from that day's podcast from yours truly. You also get some links to other Wolves coverage from around the web and some national articles as well a couple days a week as part of that. So go to LockedOnDaily.com and subscribe to Locked On Wolves and to the Not Locked On Wolves newsletter there. All right, let's talk about this this game. This was a really fun game, like I said off the top, and a frustrating loss for Minnesota once again. I mean, like we said that obviously the Memphis game a week and a half ago, that one was even more frustrating because actually, I don't know. They were probably almost equally frustrating. Both games the Wolves should have won and lost by a possession to a team that they're chasing in the Western Conference. And right now the Wolves are like 6 games behind Memphis. So I don't know that the tiebreaker is going to matter all that much, but obviously it counts more when you lose against teams in your conference. And it hurt to lose this one. It was one Minnesota led by 7 at the end of the first. They led by 11 at halftime. They were still up 5 going to the fourth and built their lead back up to double figures in the fourth quarter a couple different times. And frankly, did a really good job holding off these Memphis surges in the fourth quarter. Like Memphis it felt like, oh man, they got it back to 2. Wolves call a timeout. The Wolves push it back to 7. And then it gets back to 3. They push it back to 6. Then it gets down. I think it got to 1 at one point. And it didn't actually, the game wasn't ever tied other than the first couple of minutes of the game until it was 100-100. And I think at one point it was like 82-80. Like it was within a bucket. And the Wolves kept just kind of right when Memphis got close, they would kind of push them back. And it was actually really impressive, responses by the Wolves on the road. And I thought like that part was great. And then down the stretch, the last few possessions, things got a little bit dicey for Minnesota. I want to kind of start there. I just want to hit a couple things real quick, and then I want to start with the end of the game, I guess, or continue at the end of the game. The overall kind of flow of this thing was interesting. The Wolves were very cold to start. When this game started, Minnesota was ice cold from the field. Memphis built, it was not quite as bad as the other night when the Wolves were down, 13-2 to start the game. But they were down 7-0. The Wolves didn't score until the 8:30 mark when Jaden McDaniels got a dunk off a nice pass from Julius Randle. So it was 7-2 with 3.5 minutes gone in this game. And then it was 11-2. And then it was 16-5. And Minnesota was just kind of struggling to get on track. They only had 8 points at the midway point. 9 points at the midway point of the first quarter. And so it was just cold shooting to start and just fine, mediocre defense. Memphis was making everything. And then as the quarter wore on, Memphis went ice cold. And I thought Minnesota did a pretty good job defensively. I think I saw on the TNT broadcast, they said that 43 points was at halftime for Memphis was their lowest scoring half of any game this season. Of any half in any game this season, 43 points was their low scoring mark. And this is a really good offensive team. This was a combination of solid defense from Minnesota. I didn't think it was otherworldly. I didn't think it was as impressive as we saw against the Knicks last Friday. Like, it wasn't quite as swarming, but I thought it was solid. And bad shooting from Memphis. And then the most impressive thing was the defensive rebounding for Minnesota. Remember, the Grizzlies had 25 or 23 offensive rebounds against the Wolves a week and a half ago in that win at Target Center. And this time around, Minnesota limited that pretty significantly early in the game. The defense was good. The defensive rebounding was better, which obviously is part of the defense. And as I always like to remind folks on the show, there's only 3 ways that a possession ends in basketball. It's either a bucket, a turnover, or it's a defensive rebound. Those are your only options. And if you're not going to turn them over, what do you got to do? You got to get a defensive rebound. And Minnesota was good with that early. And you look at the final box score, and Minnesota actually had 17 offensive rebounds. Memphis only had 13. But I'm pretty sure in the first half, that was less than 5 offensive rebounds for Memphis. It was a pretty good job for Minnesota to limit the Grizzlies and limit what they could do offensively in the entire first half. Again, 43 points at halftime, which was a low watermark for Memphis in any half this season. But then in the second half, that flipped a little bit. Memphis started to get some offensive rebounds, and they outscored the Wolves by 6 in the third quarter, but Minnesota did enough to still have a 5-point lead going to the fourth. But the defensive rebound started to get a little bit spottier for Minnesota. The 50-50 balls started to go a little bit more in Memphis's favor, and that's when things started to clearly turn in this game. And that was the fear all along was the defensive rebounding stuff. And then Memphis would potentially be able to push the pace, maybe turn the Wolves over a little bit. Sure enough, they did turn the Wolves over 16 times in this game, which Memphis wants to play fast. Minnesota doesn't. And the Wolves ended up giving 22 points up off of those 16 turnovers. And per usual, the Wolves only scored, Memphis turned over 13 times. The Wolves only scored 12 points off of 13 Memphis turnovers. Part of that is live ball versus dead ball turnovers. I'd be willing to bet Memphis had less live ball turnovers than Minnesota. They obviously had 3 less overall turnovers, but I think Minnesota's were a bit sloppier, middle of the floor, leading to fast breaks the other way. Then the second piece of it is Memphis wants to push pace. Minnesota doesn't. And in some, I think, depending on the matchup, that's fine. This is a tough one because if Memphis pushes pace, there were a couple plays. There was one, Rob Dillingham scored at, we'll talk about this, but Dillingham scored on Jaren Jackson Jr. in the second quarter, toward the end of the second quarter, I think it was. And Memphis pushed pace off the make and scored on the other end. Minnesota didn't get back, didn't get set. And it was Memphis running after a make and scoring on Minnesota in the open floor. And that became an issue as the game wore on as well. And then that led to the end. And I want to talk a little bit briefly here about the end of the game. And like I said, it was 100-100. That was the first time that Memphis had come back to tie the game since midway through the first when the Wolves took the lead for the first time. And we'll talk about how the Wolves did that later. But I think the close of the game is what's most important here. With 4 minutes left, Desmond Bane hits a couple of free throws after a pair of pretty weak calls by the officials. Fine, whatever. I don't want to talk too much about the officiating. There were a couple of weak calls. Bane gets the free throw line, hits a couple of free throws to tie the game. Ant hits a probably ill-advised step-back jumper. The Grizzlies come down. Desmond Bane scores. Now the Wolves call a timeout. Out of the timeout, Naz gets called for traveling. He did travel. They could have called a trip or a push, I guess, that kind of led to it. But if they weren't going to call the foul, it was a travel. So, fine. Naz looks like he's going to lose his mind. They come back the other side. Rudy makes a great defensive play on Desmond Bane. Naz gets the rebound, but gets trapped under the basket and throws it away. Then he gets called for a foul on Jaren Jackson going up to try and score. I thought the foul call was poor. I thought it was a clean block by Naz, but it was a bad play by Naz to turn it over there. It just was. And now Minnesota's down 4. Okay. They come down after the free throws. And by the way, Chris Finch subs Naz out of the game, which I thought made sense in that moment because Naz was so emotional. It was impressive he didn't get a technical after he was called for that foul. He was mad about the travel. He was mad about the turnover, and then he was mad about the foul call. And this is a great game for Naz. We'll talk about that too a little bit later. Conley misses a 3, but gets the rebound, gets it to Gobert. And then for some reason, Gobert, I think he tried to force it to Julius Randle along the baseline, and Brandon Clark picked it off. That was like a classic take a beat, kick it back out. Or this wouldn't have been as good of an option, but it would have been better than throwing it directly to Brandon Clark. Take a dribble and try and go up and score. They're undoubtedly going to foul you, even though Rudy's not going to make a shot probably from 8 feet away. But they're going to foul him, and then he gets the line, which is better than a turnover. Anyway, Gobert gets called for a foul on the other end then, and John Morant makes a couple of free throws. It's now a 6-point game. Naz comes back in the game. He cools off, comes back in for offense. This time he enters for Rudy, so both Julius and Naz are on the floor. It's an offense for defense situation. We're down 6 points. We need as much offense on the floor as we want, is what Chris Finch is saying. So now they're down 6 with 2 minutes to play. There's a couple interesting things that happen here down the stretch, including the decision by Chris Finch to call timeout with 5 seconds left. I want to talk about all that here next. We'll get into studs and duds. We'll talk a lot of Dillingham, I promise. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Of course, we now know who the final 4 teams in the NFL are. Unfortunately, all 3 NFC North teams eliminated before the conference round, which is kind of crazy considering they were like 3 of the best 4 teams, arguably 3 of the best 5 teams in the entire NFL this year. But the lines you have for this coming weekend, Championship Sunday, the Eagles are favored by 5.5, I should say, over the Commanders at home. The Chiefs are 1.5-point favorites at home against the Bills, which feels right. I think both those lines are probably fair. Eagles 5.5 at home and Chiefs 1.5 at home, but both should be good games. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right. So Wolves are down 106-100 with a couple minutes to play. And if you're new to the podcast, I don't usually go blow by blow for the whole game. But this game had a pretty interesting flow. And the final couple minutes had some interesting decisions from Chris Finch. And, we talked about Naz's issues. So I think there's just enough to unpack here to kind of dig into this. We'll talk about a couple more big picture things here in a minute. So they're down by 6 after Morant makes his free throws. And then on the other end, Naz Reid hits a 3. So it cuts the lead in half. It's now a 3-point game. Jaren Jackson scores on the other end. Once again, scoring on Julius Randle, who is still in the game. Because remember, Naz came in for Rudy. So Rudy's not on the floor. Jaren Jackson scores over Julius Randle once again. Naz Reid misses a tough 2 on the other end. Kind of a forced shot, trying to do everything, whatever. He had a great game. I don't have a major problem with that. It's just everything was a bit helter-skelter at this point in the game for the Wolves. Then on the other end, the Wolves actually get a stop. John Morant misses in the paint, even without Rudy on the floor. Ant gets a tough rebound, and then Naz scores on the other end to make it a 3-point game again. Then the Wolves get another stop. They get a stop on Jaren Jackson. Naz Reid gets the rebound. The Wolves come back down the floor. They don't call a timeout here. They have 2 left, down 3. I was okay with that because then you still have both of them to play the foul game if you don't score, right? If you don't score, and they did, but they only scored a point. We'll talk about that. But if you don't score, you're down 3 with under 30 seconds. You need your timeouts anyway. Semi-broken floor, opportunity to score in transition. I'm okay with it. The Wolves come down. Anthony Edwards gets fouled. Can't quite convert. Misses the first free throw. Something else we'll talk about. He got to the line a ton, but he missed 4 free throws in this game. The Wolves as a team didn't shoot free throws well. He makes the second, so now it's a 2-point game. The Grizzlies get the ball, and the Wolves have a strong defensive possession, force the ball out. I think Randle might have knocked the ball out of bounds. The Grizzlies call timeout. They have to get the ball in bounds with about 4 seconds on the shot clock, up only 2, and they get Jaren Jackson going to the basket. I don't think it was a foul on the initial shot, but then on the rebound, Jaren Jackson tries to go back up. Ant hits his arm and actually got credited for a block. It should have been a foul on Ant, but end of game, final 10 seconds, scramble for the ball. Those are not calls that are often going to be made. But I will acknowledge it was a foul on Anthony Edwards that was not called. McDaniels comes away with the ball, and Ant gets it. I think 4.6, 4.8 on the clock. He's got the ball just shy of the timeline. Chris Finch gets his timeout called. In the moment, if they had gotten a clean rebound with if Jaren Jackson doesn't get that tip attempt, so there's 7-8 seconds left, they get a clean rebound, they gather it, Grizzlies get time to get back. That's when you call a timeout. You get 6-7 seconds. You can set up a real inbound play, plenty of time to develop. Maybe even you have an offensive rebound opportunity. Remember, you're only down 2, so you don't need a 3, but also an offensive rebound ties the game for the Wolves. Unfortunately, because of the tip attempt from Jaren Jackson, Jaden gets it with 6 seconds, and they don't get the timeout officially called until 5 seconds on the clock. Now you've only got 5 seconds, and the Grizzlies have a set defense. If you look at where Ant was when the timeout was called by Chris Finch, I know he technically called it when Jaden sailed the ball because they allowed them to advance the ball to half court. That's the whole thing, right? So officially, Ant never had the ball. The timeout was called when Jaden still had it in his hands, because otherwise, if the ball gets advanced, then the Wolves would have had to inbound the ball from the backcourt. But the refs credited the timeout at 5 seconds. Still, Ant would have had the ball at the timeline about even with one defender and one defender back. So he had like 1.5 defenders to beat. A 2 ties the game. My guess is Ant would have and should have gone all the way in for a dunk or a layup. Maybe he gets an and one and wins the game with the free throw at the line. But in that situation, I understand Chris Finch is thinking, I've got 2 of these things to burn and we get a board, I'm going to call it. So he was probably ready to go, or not probably, he was ready to call that timeout immediately. But by the time that full tip drill played out and Ant gets it in his hands at 3/4 court, I think you just let him play. Ant's going to, he's not going to not get a shot off in that situation. Is it possible he pulls a pull-up 3 to try and win the game? It's possible. Maybe Chris Finch was worried about that. But I think the right move there is to let it play out, because a 2 ties it. If you're down 3, sure, call a play to get a 3-point shot. That did not happen. Instead, Chris Finch calls timeout. And again, I'll say, if they get a clean rebound with 8 seconds, yes, call a timeout. Fine, because the Grizzlies are going to get back anyway defensively. But with 5 seconds and Ant streaking down the floor, you got to let that play out. That's how I would have liked to see Chris Finch do that. Besides that, I liked the coaching down the stretch. I like the timeout management. I like the substitution patterns. I like the offense for defense stuff with Rudy, Naz, and Julius. I think it was handled well by the coaching staff. I just didn't love that timeout. And then they don't actually run a legit play. Ant ends up bailing into the backcourt, which I'm sure was option 2 on the play call. So he gets it, momentum going away from the basket, into the backcourt. He has to dribble up and shoot a tough fadeaway over 2 defenders and completely airballs it from 26, 27 feet. And the Wolves end up losing by 2 points to Memphis. Late game execution continues to be an issue for Minnesota. It's something that they've got to work through. And again, it wasn't all bad, but enough of it was bad. I guess what I would say about the way the Wolves played toward the end of the game was it felt like John Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. were almost exclusively attempting shots in the paint or within 15 feet, and the Wolves weren't. Now, I know Ant did get to the line once there to cut it to 2 points when he missed the free throw. Naz did have a dunk with just under 2 minutes to play. But you go back through the play-by-play if you want, and I don't think now I want to be clear. I'm not saying the Wolves shouldn't be shooting threes. Don't hear me say that. But hear me say, look at this. I mean, under 4 minutes, Ant misses a 3-point step back. Bane gets to the free throw line. Ant misses a 3-point step back. Bane makes a shot in the paint. Gobert blocks a Bane attempt in the paint. Naz commits that was before Jaren Jackson got to the free throw line. Then Conley misses a 3-pointer. Then Gobert turns it over. Then Morant gets into the paint, draws a foul. Naz makes a 3-pointer. Then Jaren Jackson makes a shot in the paint. Naz misses a shot in the paint. Naz gets a dunk. And then from that point, it's basically the foul game and then the final possession. The Grizzlies were going downhill to the basket. Minnesota was a little, but not enough. Usually, if the Wolves attempt more threes than their opponent, they're going to win. In this game, Memphis shot 21% on threes, but they won this game by a bucket because they attempted 7 more free throws. And it wasn't strictly because the officials were poor, because the Wolves also got 27 free throw attempts. The Grizzlies attempted 7 more. They also made 7 more free throws than Minnesota. They turned it over 3 less times. They also, despite only getting 13 offensive rebounds, 4 less than Minnesota, Memphis had 14 more points in the paint in this game. So points in the paint, free throw attempts down the stretch were because of the aggression of Memphis going downhill, trying to get to the basket. They got the whistles and they made some tough shots. They got some offensive rebounds. Minnesota was more content to shoot threes in that situation, which isn't always a bad thing. But the quality of some of those Ant step backs, were were not great quality shots. And then sure enough, he goes to the bucket under a minute to play and he gets the foul call and then misses one of the 2 free throws. That was the biggest difference down the stretch, was Memphis going to the cup, Minnesota less so. And then ultimately the missed free throws. Like, I know Memphis wasn't great. Memphis was 79% at the line. They missed 7 as well. But the Wolves were 20 of 27. They got 5, I said earlier, 4. Ant actually missed 5 free throws, 13 of 18 in this game. Julius Randle was 1 of 3. The rest of the Wolves combined to only shoot 6 free throws, and they made all of them. So this wasn't like Rudy missing free throws. This was Randle and Edwards only missed free throws in this game for Minnesota. Now, obviously, Ant scoring 32 points on 19 shots is great, and I'm super happy he got to the line 19 times, and he still shot 8 threes, which is great. It's the picking your spots and the quality of the three-point attempts that were a bit dicey for Ant. The Grizzlies were pressing up on him so much, off the ball too. Ant had 5 turnovers and only 3 assists in this game. Minnesota just needs to be able to find offense somewhere else. And in this game, Naz was the only other one that did it. Julius Randle had 5 points on 13 shots in this game. Naz was the only other guy with more than 15 points. You know who had 15? Rob Dillingham. Let's talk about Rob Dillingham, Naz Reid, and some other, I think, mostly positives for Minnesota in this one. We'll do all that here next to close the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Prizepicks. Basketball season is heating up. We're officially past the midway point in the schedule. There's no better way to get real money action while watching your favorite NBA stars than with Prizepicks. Whether you're a diehard fan or just love some friendly competition, Prizepicks makes it fun and easy to turn your basketball knowledge into cash. Here's how it works. Pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Think LeBron's going to drop 30? Or maybe Luka is going to get more than 8 assists in a given game. Prizepicks lets you make your predictions and put your money where your mouth is in just 60 seconds. I've been using Prizepicks a bunch lately, and seriously, I've been having a blast. I mentioned the other day, if you pick Anthony Edwards to score more than 25 points, which is probably about the number you're going to see that at, well, he did in this game. That's the kind of action I'm talking about. It's a ton of fun. It's fun to root for it. With Prizepicks flex play option, even if one of your picks doesn't hit, you can still double your money. Plus, once you hit, you get your money fast, sometimes as quick as 15 minutes. It's honestly the best way to keep the game exciting. Now's the perfect time to join. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's right. No need to win to get the bonus. It's guaranteed. Prizepicks. Run your game. All right, we're going to talk studs and duds. And you know what? Let's actually lump in the rotation with that, because I want to talk some Rob Dillingham. And I talked about Ant already. You know, it's tough to not give him a stud for this game. He's the reason offensively they built the lead that they did. And he was still aggressive going to the basket. He got to the line 18 times. He shot 18 free throws and only 19 field goal attempts in this game. I actually thought it was a decent Ant game, except for the missed free throws and some of the shot selection late. And I get that ultimately they lost, but they're not in that position without him. I thought Ant is still a stud in this one. Naz Reid, 29 points on 11 of 20, 5 of 10 on threes in this game, was also huge in the first half as the Wolves built their lead. He had 8 boards, 1 assist, only 2 turnovers in 33 minutes. Rudy Gobert only played 25 minutes. Now, he was in foul trouble early, which led to Luka Garza minutes. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Mike Conley only played 25 minutes. Julius Randle played 34. Naz had 33 minutes played in this game and was really good. 29 points, again, on 20 shots, only got to the line a couple times, yet he was 6 of 10 on 2-point attempts. Like, he was pretty aggressive going to the basket, even more so than Ant was at the end of the game. He had the one dunk. He had another missed layup where there could have been a foul. He had the travel call that could have been a foul. That was his only turnover he had 2 turnovers. It was 1 of 2 turnovers for Naz in this game. But continued a strong stretch of play. We talked extensively about Naz Reid on Monday's show, and he continued to be great in this game. You know, I already talked about his challenges in the final couple of minutes, but that doesn't take away from how good he was overall in this game. And my final stud has to be Rob Dillingham. He only played 17 minutes, which was second least of anybody that saw the floor for Minnesota in this game. He was a plus 16. He led the Wolves in plus minus, 15 points on 6 of 8 shooting, 3 of 4 on threes, 3 rebounds. 3 rebounds for Rob Dillingham, which is great to see in just 17 minutes, plus 2 assists and 0 turnovers. He was actually pretty decent defensively. I thought, like, against the Knicks last Friday, he was bad defensively. He wasn't very good on Saturday defensively either. I thought he held his own in this one. He actually stripped, I think it was Jake LaRavia at one point in this, like he was helping, or there was a mismatch. He got switched on, I think it was LaRavia, and he stripped him in the paint, led to an out of bounds call that went Minnesota's way. Some really strong moments defensively for Rob Dillingham, and he continues to show complete and utter confidence in his own shot. He challenged Jaren Jackson Jr., I mentioned earlier, at the rim, and completely looked the part as like a shot in the arm off the bench, a microwave scorer, whatever you want to say. 15 points in 17 minutes on just 8 shots is nice, and he didn't get to the line at all either. I think that will come with time because he's small and he's crafty and he's going to bounce off guys, and I think he will get fouled. But to put up 15 points in 17 minutes on 8 shots and have 2 assists and no turnovers and hold his own defensively, it's hard to imagine a better stint for Rob Dillingham. And like I said, all those things I mentioned, that's him looking the part. That's what the Wolves want him to do. He's earned himself more time here moving forward, and that could eventually come in the starting lineup. Well, it's nice to have the boost off the bench. Like, Naz is giving you that anyway. Like, in this game, your bench combined for, quick math, 59 points, and the starters combined for 47 points. So, I don't know, like, maybe you're, like, he's going to do more for your starting lineup scoring-wise than Mike Conley is, obviously. And I understand that's maybe the hesitation with not, putting him in the starting lineup is you want the juice off the bench. But you still have Naz, and Conley was pretty good off the bench. Like, go back and look at what he did when Dante DiVincenzo was in the starting lineup for those 3 or 4 games the last couple weeks. I mean, Julius Randle's not going to put up too many 5-point games, but he also had single digits against the Knicks last Friday. So, I don't know. I like starting Dillingham is not the craziest thing at this point. And what's the long-term thing, right? Like at the earliest next year, but after Mike Conley retires, I mean, Dillingham's supposed to be your point guard of the future. You might as well see what you got. You're not going to be demonstrably worse with Rob Dillingham in your starting lineup. Is your defense going to suffer? Sure. You still got Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards. I think it'll be okay. We've seen it be really good lately. They're going to need the offensive juice, I think, to give somebody, besides Julius Randle to hold defenses accountable when they just blanket Anthony Edwards. Because you know who doesn't strike fear into the heart of defenses off the ball is Jaden McDaniels, Rudy Gobert, Mike Conley. They just don't. And Julius Randle, if he's not going to make shots, he was 0 of 7 on threes and 2 of 13 outs total from the floor. You need somebody else, and that's Naz and it's Rob Dillingham. Those are the only other guys on this team besides DiVincenzo who's out for, we can talk about this, but indefinitely. It could be weeks, multiple weeks, probably. We don't know this, but it indefinitely is what the team's saying. I mean, who else is going to give you that juice? It's Ant, it's Randle, and it's Naz. Dillingham is the only other guy that's going to do that for you. And I think it's completely worth putting him in the starting lineup and seeing how that goes. Who knows? We'll see. We'll look at the upcoming matchups on tomorrow's show and see if it will make sense in any of those games to put him in the starting lineup. But studs in this game are Ant, Naz, Rob Dillingham, Dud. Dud's multiple. I'm going to go Rudy Gobert. I thought struggled in this game. Now, the Wolves didn't get him the ball very much, but Rudy was doing a lot of tapping the ball around and not grabbing it. They did a pretty good job keeping the Grizzlies off the offensive glass, at least early in the game. But you know who had more rebounds than Rudy Gobert in this game? A lot of guys on the Grizzlies. That's who. Jaren Jackson at 11. Zach Edey had 7 in just 19 minutes. Desmond Bane had 6 boards. Brandon Clark had 5 boards. Luke Kennard had 4 boards. Rudy only had 4 in this game, and he was 1 of 5 shooting. A couple of steals, but he also had 3 turnovers. This was a tough game for Rudy. And then also a dud, Julius Randle, 5 points on 2 of 13 shooting, and a goose egg, 0 of 7 outside the arc. Did have a nice and 1, but he was 1 of 3 at the free throw line. 11 boards, which was nice, but he had just 7 assists. He also had 7 assists and a turnover, which is great too. But you got to get more from Julius Randle on the glass, in the scoring column. He can't have 5 points on 13 shots and an 0 of 7 from outside the arc. He'd been shooting less threes lately. And in this game, he was open a bunch. He just missed them all. Like, these were all pretty good looks. I don't think he was forcing anything too much. He just missed some shots. And that was obviously a problem for the Wolves. Peeking ahead, Minnesota has Dallas coming up on Wednesday night. That's another ESPN game. Lots of national TV games for the Wolves here in this stretch. And then they have Denver on Saturday afternoon. So another matinee coming up this coming Saturday at 2:00. So only 2 games here for the balance of the week. They're off tomorrow, Wednesday night against Dallas. 2 off days, finally, before a home game. And by the way, consecutive home games for the Wolves for the first time since December 19th and 21st. So like nearly a week before Christmas was the last time. The Wolves are going to go a month, literally a month. They're going to go from December 21st was the second of 2 games at home to January 27th without playing consecutive home games. We'll talk more about that tomorrow because that's unbelievable to me. We'll talk about how tough the schedule has been. Why not? I'm just going to get it off my chest. The schedule, the schedule in terms of travel, the schedule in terms of opponents, just a brutal stretch for Minnesota. And again, they still are playing a lot better. I know it's frustrating the results aren't there, but aside from like chunks of that OKC loss on New Year's Eve and the Cavs game where they got down 20 plus, but they pushed back. Like they haven't had a stinker since before Christmas, since right when the stretch started, when they lost to Atlanta 2 days before Christmas by double figures. That's the last time they've really turned in a bad performance. I'm sorry. I guess the Pistons game was pretty bad. All right. So once since Christmas, right? But like, things are still trending in the right direction overall for the Wolves. We'll talk about that on tomorrow's show. We'll talk about some lineup stuff and what happens with No DiVincenzo. We kind of did that a little bit Friday, but now that we know it's more of an extended period of time, we'll dig in that a bit more. And then on Wednesday, we'll preview the Dallas game Wednesday night. And that's where we'll go here the rest of the week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A reminder, you can subscribe to the daily Locked On Wolves newsletter at lockedondaily.com. One stop for ultimate Wolves and league coverage delivered right to your inbox Monday through Friday. Again, lockedondaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.